medically unexplained.
Hey there, folks. Mark Edwards here, and you're listening to the Reasoning Aloud podcast and YouTube channel. Today, I am joined by a friend of the channel, George. He goes by Richard Hannay on Twitter, and we are going to talk about the Greek Civil War. You might remember George from a few episodes ago where we had him on to talk about the rise and fall of the Golden Dawn Party in Greece. And I had him back on because he actually did his dissertation on the Greek Civil War, and it is a fascinating story, especially fascinating for those of us on the left who are sometimes concerned about, preoccupied with, thinking about revolution. And the Greek Civil War is a very good test case or microcosm of what happens when you find yourself in the material conditions that allow for or precipitate that kind of a thing, and what it looks like when everything goes right for you, but you're surrounded by people who have an interest in you not succeeding. It's a very interesting story. It's a very tragic story. And I think it's one that anyone who is of the leftist persuasion should pay attention to and learn more about. So I was very happy to have George back on the show to talk about that. Those of you who are watching this on YouTube will notice that this part, the introduction, is the only part that has video. George and I had some technical difficulties. We weren't able to get his video to work, so we just decided to push forward and do it as audio only. I actually like listening to the podcast myself. I understand a lot of people like the video too, which is why I offer it. But in this case, I personally don't think anything was lost by that. You can always check out everything I do on the podcast. I'm available anywhere you get your podcasts, Spotify, iTunes, all that good stuff. For those of you who watch the YouTube channel and do not listen to the podcast, this is a really good time for you to go out and do that. Go out there, like, subscribe, give me a 5-star rating. If you like what I do here, it really helps, really helps spread the show, get the word out. It helps me with the algorithm, so that is a very good way for you to support what I'm doing here, in addition to liking, subscribing, and sharing my content here on YouTube. If you want to be extra cool and support me directly, you can become a patron. I have a Patreon, and the wonderful people who have donated to that and continue to do so will appear on screen now. Going forward, I'm going to be releasing all of the audio of all the content that I produce on Patreon as soon as I finish producing it. So, for instance, this episode that I recorded is probably not going to come out for another 5 or 6 weeks from the time that I'm making this recording. Patrons will get it very quickly. So that is an added bonus for those of you who like what I do enough to give me money that doesn't disenfranchise people who may not be in a financial situation where they can afford to do that. So that's an added bonus for you. If you want the stuff I do early, sign up, throw me $1 a month. It really helps out. If you don't want to do a monthly subscription, I also have PayPal and Cash App. You can find that in the down there part. Click on those, throw me whatever you think this is worth, and I will be very happy and very thankful. I also have a second YouTube channel called RA Clips. If you go to the main page of my YouTube channel and scroll down under the listing of videos under favorited channels, it'll be there. You can click on that. Go ahead and like and subscribe to that. If you're not somebody who wants to sit down and listen to a 2 or 3 hour podcast in one go, I get it. That's what that channel's there for. It's there for people who just want the highlights. They want to listen to 10 or 15-minute clips about a specific thing. I made that just for you. So go out there and subscribe to that, share that content as well. If you want to watch me play Stardew Valley as I unwind from work, you can find a link to my Twitch channel where I stream probably once or twice a week down there in the show notes as well. And that's pretty much it for the housekeeping. This is a fascinating story that we're about to tell you, that George is about to tell you, and I'm about to pester him with questions over, and I don't want to keep you from it any longer. So without further delay, I give you George also known as Richard Hannay. Okay, George, aka Richard Hannay on Twitter. Thank you so much for joining us once again. We're happy to have you back, and today we are going to be talking about the Greek Civil War. Is that right?
Yeah, it's always a pleasure, Mark. And yeah, we're talking about the Greek Civil War. I think it's a very under discussed topic. Lefties in the United States talk a lot about insurgency and revolution in South America, but it's a pretty interesting little tidbit of how Greece descended into civil war and what lessons we can learn, from it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I am actually fairly almost completely ignorant about this subject, right? Like I have close friends who are Greek. I've been to Greece 3 times, and I have heard Greece has been involved in so many wars. Like it's
Yeah.
basically just been in a constant state of war for really its entire existence and even before its existence. I think many people are unaware of just how new of a country Greece actually is in its present form
hmm
in terms of the state. Which, if I'm not mistaken, really didn't come into existence until after the end of the First World War. Is that accurate?
No, it
Okay.
so
See.
Greece really, yeah. The foundation of the modern Greek state really comes with the Greek Revolution of
Okay.
1821, which is what most people consider the foundation of the modern Greek state.
Okay.
And really, it was a tiny state at its existence, and it indebted itself immediately uh, to big Western powers, mainly France, Russia, and primarily the United Kingdom, which became, and then of course it was the British Empire, and the British Empire kind of became its like patron saint. It controlled most of its debt. It was Greece was a seafaring nation, so and the UK controlled the seas, and it was kind of like a, think of it like a vassal state, like a,
Mm,
it wasn't it was semi-independent, and there were big political parties in Greece at its inception. It became a legitimate state really in 1830. It received a Glucksburg, like an, what's he, no, Austrian, or a Germanic king, Otto, and it had the French party, the British party, and the Russian party. Those were the parties. Can you imagine about like foreign
mm.
interference when your parties are literally named after other countries?
Yeah, it's
So
Byzantium 2 Electric Boogaloo.
yeah, it was. So yeah, it's, and it really, its real big expansion, the way its borders look like today, came through really a good decade of war between 1912 and 1922. That's
Okay.
really when the Greek border like really formed as it is. Greek really uh, was a republic throughout the majority of its existence. It did,
Okay.
however, go through a number of dictatorships, and especially during the 20th century ones are the most famous ones. And um, yeah, the really, I think our story really begins after the catastrophe in Asia Minor, which was the Greco-Turkish War of 1922.
Okay.
Uh,
Let
yeah.
me just step back for a second and kind of contextualize this. So we're talking about the Greek Civil War. What what years are we looking at when this happened?
The Greek Civil War, well, there's disagreements as to when it really began. People will say that the official real timeline of the Civil War as we know it now would be 1946 to 1949. But in my opinion, the most interesting part of the Greek Civil War is from 1942 to 1946. That's the interesting part, because
Okay.
the Greek Civil War being fought out, there is less interest there. And really, what I did my dissertation on is how it began and what the um, political factors were that contributed to it.
Right. No, I think that's probably a more interesting story as well. Just the politics and the social and material conditions that led to a conflict that lasted for 3 years is probably more interesting than the. I mean, there's
Then the conflict
no, no
itself.
disrespect to our military battle nerd friends, but I have a more love for the intrigue and the politics. Um, and is that and that's what you studied, correct?
I studied military history, but
Okay.
I find the politics and the intrigue of the Greek Civil War to be, in a sense, like way bigger than the battles themselves. Although
Okay.
there are some impressive aspects of the Greek Civil War, and yeah, I think we should really talk about the factions first, a little bit of background, and then go into this real big intrigue and
Okay.
how, like, yeah. So, okay, so we're starting really. Our story begins in 1922 because back then, the between the 1920 and 1922, end of World War One, Greece was involved briefly in the First World War. There was a national
Hmm.
schism during the wartime because our king was pro German and our prime minister was pro British, and at some point there were two rival governments in Greece. Eventually, Greece was forced to really side with the Allies, with the Entente, and the that was pretty a good move on Greece's part. Um, but and There was a pursuit of the grand idea after the war. So the idea that basically the coast of Anatolia would become Greek. This is really simplistic right now. Like
Hmm.
there is it's just serves as some background. And the uh, the Greece engaged in a war after some of the concessions that were given weren't enough. It was East Thrace was given to Greece after the war. Um, there was um, there was a Izmir, which was Smyrna in Greek, a city in the coast of Turkey, of
Yeah,
Anatolia.
it's also the
And
name of a small town in Florida where my grandmother was from, Smyrna.
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. Over there in the U.S., you have like what 24 Athenses.
Yeah, no, we 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 stand Greece
Yeah,
apparently.
I
They're,
guess.
um, so so this started. So I'm sorry, we're in Smyrna was ceded to Greece.
Yeah, so these parts proceeded to Greece. There was a political struggle within Greece, and then a war broke out between Turkey and Greece.
Mhm.
Basically the Young Turks, their revolution was going on, and Greece, along with Britain and France, I'm not sure on France, but along with Britain, they invaded Anatolia and got very close to Ankara,
Mhm.
but then the British pulled out. The Greek forces weren't enough to hold back Turkey, and the Turks drove back the Greek army all the way back to Smyrna and burned the city, sacked the city. Then after the war, that was the Smyrna catastrophe. That's actually where my part of my grandparents come from. Uh,
Is that what the book Farewell Anatolia is based off of?
oh, I'm not sure. I haven't read that book.
It's a book that takes place around the same time, and I think it's it's written from the perspective of an Anatolian Greek
Well,
peasant
then,
who,
yeah, it's
yeah,
probably about that
yeah,
because after the war, there was an exchange of populations,
hmm,
and a big part of Anatolian Greeks came back to Greece, around 1.5 million. There were, which is really huge for the time. Keep in mind, Greece is a small country. Um, a lot of them didn't speak Greek. A lot of them spoke Greek but were Muslim, and this really it really grew the size of Greece in a sense, but it also made the political landscape really interesting. The real primary conflict there was between the Venezuelists and which were the Liberal Party, and the monarchists, who were anti-democracy and primarily involved with the Greek monarchy. So those were the two reigning parties ever since the National Schism, and then there was a third agent in Greek politics, which was the Greek Communist Party, which is still around today, but it was founded in 1918, and basically they were illegal for the longest time. And after a series of in the interwar, after a series of like conservative and sometimes liberal governments, in 1932 there was a failed coup attempt by Venezuelist officers, and the army was then purged by rightists and made more right wing. There was a failed dictatorship in 1935 of a rightist general, which only held for a few months, and then
When
the
Sorry, when you say right wing in this context, do you mean pro-monarchist?
yeah, it's
Okay.
right. The Greek right wing was pro-monarchist at the time, and the Greek monarch was an Anglophile at the time. He was basically British. He, for the most part, he lived out of Greece, and he wanted to reign like an absolute monarch without real consideration of the political intricacies of Greece. That was George II of Greece, and basically he gave his approval in order to stabilize the situation in Greece. He gave his approval for a right-wing fascist dictator to rise to power. He became prime minister first and then dictator. So it was Ioannis Metaxas, who's basically who was the fascist dictator of Greece between 1936 and 1941 when he died. Um, so during his reign, he basically transformed Greece to a hardline anti-communist state. He expanded the police and the gendarme. He created the General Asfalia, so basically the General Security, and which is like a security agency that hunted leftists. He
Mm,
imprisoned and tortured thousands. He basically his chief of security, Maniadakis, was called had the very apt nickname the Greek Himmler.
hmm
And basically they infiltrated and destroyed the underground like organization of the Communist Party. But of course, with underground organizations such as the Communist Party, it's really hard to eradicate the majority of them. And this whole operation was kind of put on pause when Greece entered World War II. Metaxas was really hoping to avoid that war because he didn't think Greece could really hold out for a long time. He thought that there were contingency plans for Bulgaria. Greece was stronger than Bulgaria, but Italy is a far bigger country, and it was far bigger then, militarily much more powerful, had a huge air force, had a huge navy. Greece had none of that. So they were trying to avoid the war, but Mussolini was really intent on conquering Greece. Um, the Communist Party at the time saw the fascist Italy as a bigger threat than fascism within Greece, and they thought that they could possibly the Greek state could possibly be eradicated. So they supported the government in its efforts to defeat the Italians.
mm,
So briefly, the Greco-Italian War in during 1940, where Italy tried to invade through Albania into northern Greece, that invasion failed miserably. The Greek army pushed back Italy, despite being mostly outnumbered, outgunned, outplaned, just everything Italy had more of. But the Greek army managed; it had more competent generals, more competent officers. better sighted gunnery, better terrain handling. So they managed to push back Italy into Albania. Then Germany decided we're gonna invade. Uh, the In the meantime, the Greek dictator died. He died of, I think, throat cancer, maybe. Yeah, I think throat cancer. Anyway, the Greek dictator dies in 1941, and shortly after, Greece is invaded, and a collaboration government is set up in Athens. The collaboration government has really uh, no real power. It's unfathomably corrupt, and of course, the state apparatus, police, military, and pretty much the whole the whole oppressive apparatus that Greece had going due to its dictator before the war was broken apart. It was torn apart by the Germans because they thought of it as a mechanism for internal resistance. The problem with that is for the Germans was that their occupation was kind of powerless in the beginning. They had broken down the state apparatus, and the communists escaped. They got organized again, and they started like a resistance movement to bring
Mm.
Greece back, to take Greece back and take control and kick out the Germans. The primary objective of the Greek resistance movement at the time was getting rid of the Germans.
And
Uh,
these were splintered right wing former supporters of the Greek dictator that were doing this. Is that
no,
no?
the former state apparatus. Some of them went into the collaboration government. Some of
Okay.
them fled with the government because when Greece started to fall, first the collaboration government fled to Crete. Then the Battle of Crete happened, and they got evacuated with the Greek navy over to Alexandria. So
Okay. All right.
they set up the Cairo government, which was basically a direct successor of the fascist dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas. It was a direct successor government, basically the same officials, with the difference that it was now under the patronage and complete control of the United Kingdom.
Hmm.
So Britain controlled this government completely. And of course the Greek forces in exile, around 18,000 men. Nothing too major, nothing too serious. But so there's the collaboration government in Athens. There is the government of the of in exile. We'll call it the Cairo government, and then there is the resistance organizations. Now, the British realized that there's going to be a vibrant resistance movement in Greece really early, because they have agents within Greece, and they reported, activity to the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office, the British Foreign Office, is hardline pro-monarchist. They want the Greek monarchy to return because it also fled along with the government. They want the Greek monarchy to return, but Greek people in Greece are really anti-monarchy.
Yeah.
Because they saw it as the vehicle for oppression, the vehicle that brought Metaxas to power.
Right. Why was the British uh, behind the monarchists as opposed to the Democratic Party?
So basically, the main reason was the Liberal Party was fractured and destroyed, and even though the Liberal and the even though the Liberal Party did have anti-monarchist values, it couldn't get organized during that time. Churchill was a hardline conservative, and
Hmm.
so was his Foreign Office, and they thought that the monarchist party was better able to control Greece and also allow Britain to have more power and control over Greek affairs, over Greek rights to Cyprus. They really didn't want Cyprus to go to Greece because there were talks of unification between Greece and
Okay.
Cyprus. There's
Okay.
really a litany of issues, but
So
the
the
British were hardline
essentially
pro.
the same reason any Western government has backed a right wing or like or
Yeah,
right wing
in a
monarchist
sense, yeah.
position. Yeah, yeah, all that stuff. Okay, that makes sense.
So in this background, the at this time the communists are organizing. So the Greek Communist Party is underground, and they decide that the primary focus. So this is late 1942. They decide that the primary focus of the Greek resistance will be the liberation of Greece, because there's no revolutionary action that can take place before Greece is liberated.
Makes
Uh,
sense.
yeah, the party decides to help create a. They decide to unite with other left parties and create the National Liberation Front, which is EAM.
It's
EAM,
say that one more time.
the National Liberation Front, EAM.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. Okay.
yeah, EAM,
Yeah.
and yeah, and the primary goal of EAM is to unite Greeks in like resistance, sabotage, and also set up governing bodies where the government has abandoned everything. Because keep in mind, Greek collaboration government super corrupt, super inept. There's really nothing they can do to control the countryside. All real power flows from the Germans and the Italians. They have little to no legitimacy. So
And are
and mhm.
these like uh governments that they're setting up are so these are lefties mostly in the National Liberation Front, so
Yeah,
presumably these
it
are like
is really
direct
left wing.
democracy kind of things that they're dealing, or
Um,
are they Soviets, or what are they
they
kind of
are
setting up?
more Soviet and aligned than anything else, because
Okay.
at the time the Communist Party of Greece was super pro-Soviets,
Okay.
as it was for most communist parties of that
So
era.
they're setting up in the style of like actual Soviet workshops or like syndicalist, or is it
Um,
something different?
let me describe to you, because
Okay.
so I'll very briefly I'll talk about this, what their organization looked like.
Okay.
Basically, EAM first organized in the cities, and their main goal within the cities was food relief, because Greece was plundered pretty much to the extreme by the Axis, and there were famines in 1941. Hundreds of thousands died. It was a really horrible time for Greece. So basically, their first thing was food relief.
Hmm.
Afterwards, they decided that the countryside was weakly held enough that that partisan warfare and guerrilla warfare could really take hold and liberate some parts of Greece and some big towns, and hopefully like set up an internal state. So EAM went around in villages and basically encouraged self-organization. But of course, the authorities there kind of broke it down. So EAM decided, okay, we're gonna have our own like guerrilla movement, the Greek People's Liberation Army, which sounds a lot like the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese one. But it was its own organization. It was the Greek People's Liberation Army, or ELAS, which, funnily enough, the acronym is the exact same name as the country, uh,
Yeah.
Hellas, which is, yeah, it's just a little interesting thing they did there. So
Good
basically,
branding.
the Greek People's Liberation Army starts out as a tiny, tiny guerrilla movement. There is 15 guys in the beginning of the movement, and they start by going around in small villages and disarming gendarme patrols and some Italians, and handing their weapons over to other members that would wish to join them in the guerrilla movement. Um, they grow in size slowly, and by mid to late 1942, there's like 200 to 300 people in the Greek People's Liberation Army. Now, by liberating small villages, what the leader of the Greek People's Liberation Army at the time, Aris Velouchiotis, he is a very interesting. Imagine the Greek Che Guevara, okay, that
Hmm.
kind of guy, Aris Velouchiotis, and he has also a very majestic beard. Yeah. Anyhow,
You
yeah,
got to. You got to.
yeah, of course. Yeah, majestic beard, bandoliers, the whole 9 yards.
Yeah.
Yeah, he even disguised as a priest at some point to go to Athens for on like a mission to talk with Eam leadership.
And the
Uh,
classics do not die, man.
yeah, of course. So what he encouraged in terms of self-organization was to set up village committees. So basically, the village would handle its own affairs, and people's courts, where if they so that village justice could be enforced. So basically, like it was an interesting thing. It didn't really function very well because keep in mind there were some silly vendettas that were handled in terms of like village justice.
Hmm.
There wasn't some kind of extensive legal system, but it was mostly left up to like the people. There wasn't that there wasn't a hardline authoritarian control of Eam over the villages. They relied very heavily on them for supplies, after all, and their popularity depended on them often defending the villages from bandits, defending like attacking Italian garrisons and German garrisons where possible. The Germans weren't that much involved in countryside patrols at the time in 42. So basically, there's the first level of organization um, was the village, like the village council and the village like food relief and village like justice. So that was the
So,
first step.
so
Uh,
to compare that to like something that modern lefties might be familiar with, that is very much in the vein of starting with building dual power systems first, and then would that be fair to say?
by dual power systems, you mean?
So, providing things for people by people that the government normally would do so that you are no longer reliant on that centralized power system.
Yeah, in a sense, yeah. Because there is really an absence of government at this time. Really,
Okay.
Greece is in a state of anarchy in a sense.
Mm,
So basically, the villages go and organize themselves. They talk with other villages and try to set up like a decentralized community thing. EAM doesn't have as much direct control over everything. They just kind of send their representatives and try to organize the villages so that they can run themselves and support EAM indirectly,
gotcha. Okay.
so that food can be distributed, so that more support for the Liberation Army can be support. Can arrive. More scavenged weapons. There were still hidden weapons all around Greece from the army. There were Italian garrisons that were isolated, so they were also an intel network
Mm,
for EAM, and they had a really, really extensive hold of the countryside fairly early. Now, I'll depart from our timeline very briefly and tell you at the height of its power, EAM in 1944 controlled around three-fourths of Greece.
mm,
There was only a few places in Greece that EAM didn't have complete power. At this time, EAM had set up a government of its own that that was supposedly elected. These elections weren't exactly great, but they were elections by like normal ballot. They It was a bit like of an autocratic Soviet style election system, but it
mm,
was far better than anything like than anything occupied Greece could handle
right.
normally. Now you'd expect that no election, just like an autocrat or like a strong man would control the resistance, but they kind of tried to have like their own like kind of voted on government. They had the government of the mountain, which was the basically the governing free Greece. They issued passports for movement between villages and parts of Greece, so that bandits couldn't move as easily. They had a very extensive supply network. There was a legal system. There was So basically, imagine like a shadow state built out of
Yeah.
nothing
Yeah.
within an occupied country, which is an unbelievable feat. It is
Yeah.
very similar to what the partisans did in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, no, a pretty incredible achievement. So, just to kind of summarize where we're at, um, so there's this, we there was a, so we started with a war with Turkey, which caused population shifts, and then a dispute between the monarchists, the Democrats, and the communists, and then going into the 30s and 40s, we had the installment of a right wing dictator who was a hardline anti communist. He expanded police powers, and then World War II happened. The Greece is now an occupied country, and we have this left wing organization that is sort of getting villages and people in the countryside to self organize. And then, because of that, they are showing some level of fealty to those rebels. And there's sort of a supply back and forth between stability and actual material support. Is that kind of a good summation?
Yeah, in a sense, there's also the implosion of the Liberal Party. It doesn't.
Okay.
It didn't really exist. So in occupied Greece, really the real power lies at the hands of the Germans, the Italians, and their conflict with Eamelas.
Okay.
Also, at the same time, this is 1942. We're still talking about late 42. The British are interested in the Greek resistance, but they don't really like Eamelas because they're communist, right?
Right.
In their eyes, at least. And it is heavily controlled by the Communist Party, yes, but Eamelas was kind of an umbrella organization of the entire Greek left at the time. They even tried to work with a lot of liberal politicians that had been kind of ostracized from government during the Metaxist years.
Okay.
Um, so basically, they don't want to work with them. So they find this kind of like opportunistic uh, brigadier who is called Napoleon Zervas, yeah, named after Napoleon. You know,
Hmm.
same name. And he used to be a liberal. He was expelled from the army for participating in like in some like attempted like liberal coups, and he was he was in Athens. He had created his own organization. It wasn't exactly doing anything. It was called EDES. It was the Greek Republican League, and their main thing, their charter was like an anti-monarchy, uh, like pro social democracy kind of agenda. This was primarily like their political agenda was primarily handled by the more the more educated wing of this organization, but the British like found Zervas and they decided, okay, how about you create your own resistance movement, so we don't have to like deal with the communists. Zervas was really unwilling to go anywhere near a mountain. He was overweight. He was a drunk. He was like he played cards. He was really out of shape. And like guerrilla fighting isn't exactly an easy thing. So he was not really willing to go anywhere near a mountain. The British gave him 24,000 like gold pounds for him to get out in the mountains and create his own organization. He still wouldn't do it, although he accepted the money. And then eventually they sent British agents to go and threaten him to go out into the mountains, or otherwise he would be denounced to the Germans. So he goes out in the mountains at around the same time that EAM is building its base of support and it's creating the People's Liberation Army. He has a small band of fairly unequipped guerrillas, and at this time, the British Special Operations Executive is sent to Greece to contact him. The Special Operations Executive is a kind of an organization created by Churchill and Britain to do kind of sabotage missions in occupied countries.
Okay.
Yeah, and and support like a Greek resistance. And their main objective was the blowing of the Gorgopotamus Bridge, which was, I think, what was the operation called? Um, I'm forgetting now, but it was Operation Harling.
Harling?
Harling, yeah, the Harling
Okay.
mission. Basically, we'll talk about the SOE from the perspective of like the second in command, Chris Woodhouse, who has written pretty extensively about it. The leader also wrote extensively about it, Eddie Myers, and I've read both their books. But basically, the SOE arrives, and their main thing was like cutting supply lines because Greece really has only one railway at this time between Salonika and Athens,
Hmm.
and they want to cut the railway bridge. And they first they were sent. They weren't told anything about the Amelas, and they were told to cooperate with Zervas in doing this mission, Napoleon, and they did try this, but they also met Aris Veliotis and the People's Liberation Army in the meantime, and Aris was fairly willing to like work on this mission with Zervas, and they kind of coordinated this whole thing. There were around there were around 60 or so of Eves men. There were, I think, 7 from the Harling mission, the SOE guys, and around 100 to 150 People's Liberation Army, uh, like guerrillas in the operation. They managed to seize the bridge and blow it up. And this was a massive feat, heard all over Greece. It like invigorated resistance, and after this, like the People's Liberation Army and EAM really thought that okay, maybe we have a chance to unite the resistance under our banner. After all, the EAM is far larger than any other organization of resistance, far more organized. There are some nationalist and right wing organizations, but they tend to be extremely corrupt, small, and very autocratic. So EAM sees itself as really the only big legitimate organization that can centralize, Greek resistance. Of
Hmm.
course, the British Special Operations Executive does not want that, and Zervas, Napoleon, doesn't want that either, because
Right.
he is very ambitious and he thinks that collaboration with the British is very much preferred. Uh,
Now, how large is Napoleon's crew at this point versus EAM?
Napoleon's crew is, I think, the central organization was mainly like a few dozen people, along with like 100 or so guerrillas.
Mhm.
EAM had thousands already across many villages and many hundreds of guerrillas. So EAM
Okay.
was far larger even
And
back then.
is it Zervis? Is that right?
Yeah.
Zervis. They are pro liberal democracy, but backed by Britain, or are they pro monarchist?
That's an interesting question because they start out as very pro-liberal democracy, but then British agents pressure Zervas to become more friendly with the monarchy. But I
Hmm.
will, I will first. I think something should be mentioned is yeah. There's a profound mistrust in communist circles of Britain, and this was no
Fair.
different it was no different for EAM, because they thought that Britain would want to enforce the monarchy's return to Greece, which was, keep in mind, this is by far the most majority view in Greece at the time was anti-monarchist. Greeks did not want the monarchy back. So Zervas, wait, very quickly, the SOE had explicit orders to work with more monarchist groups, but they couldn't find any. So that was the main reason why they worked with Zervas. Uh,
Gotcha. Okay.
and they're basically so this is a I'm going to talk about this is 29th or 30th of December 1942, the end of the year, last day of the year. And this is a meeting that happened that is really controversial because every historian that I've read from and every in-person account says something different about this meeting. The main So from the left perspective, uh, the Aris Velikotis, who's the leader of the People's Liberation Army, goes over without authorization from the party to unite, set up a meeting with Zervas so that the resistance could be united in a tripartite leadership, where Aris, uh, having the bigger group, will be the like person in command. Zervas will be the military general, as he has the highest rank as a military member, since Aris was an artillerist, but like a fairly low-ranking officer during the war. Um, and there would be a third person that would be a like a person like a political officer of common trust, like a person that both organizations would place their trust in, and so that the leadership could work without like much conflict. Now that was the stated goal. So Aris basically gathered a troop of people and went over to find Zervas in his territory in the Epirus in the north of Greece. And Zervas avoided him for a while, and then they managed to set up that meeting in Rovelista, in a monastery. Now, more right-wing historians will say there were around 400 people in Aris' troop, and that he was going over there to explicitly exterminate uh, Zervas. But this is more older history. More modern accounts, and especially like when reading like the first person accounts, are more clear that, and also the SOE agents were pretty clear that there wasn't this plan to exterminate Zervas. They were really going there to meet him, and the reason why they took a big troop was because they wanted to engage in a battle in Mikrohorio. But this is a bit of an aside. Basically, Zervas in the meeting, um, he said that our common officer of trust will be Chris Woodhouse, the British agent. And Chris Woodhouse doesn't speak of this almost at all in his account, but we have more accounts saying that this was mentioned, so that's what we take from. So Aris was like really appalled at this gesture because he thought that Britain had no real reason to be involved in Greek politics, especially internal resistance politics. But Zervas was really insistent, and Ari said, "Okay, let it just don't let Woodhouse be in this organization. If you want, you can be the officer of common like trust between our organizations. Let someone else be the military leader." Anyway, negotiations of this kind of broke down. Communist scholars have implied that it was mostly Britain's fault, but from what we know is that Zervas had his own selfish reasons for why this resistance, like unification, wouldn't happen. He thought he would be absorbed by AM, which isn't entirely incorrect, but it would mostly be in a cooperative sense, not in a we're going to assimilate and destroy you sense. Um, so the resistance remained disunited, and there was a series of conflicts that arose in during 1943. What was happening is that EAM was vastly outgrowing EDES, because mainly it had much more grassroots support and it had a much bigger organization. And yeah, and during that time, of outgrowing and outpacing this, Britain remained committed to supporting, supplying, funding, and helping this, which was really suspicious to resistance members and had the SOE in a really tough spot. Because the SOE
Right.
was supposedly there to do the best possible resistance, and the best vehicle for resistance was EAMLAS, but the British Foreign Office really wanted to support this and the return of the king post-war. So the Edes received twice the amount of supplies and 5 or 6 times the amount of money than EAMLAS received, despite EAMLAS at the time being 6 times bigger. So you can
Oh,
see how this arose suspicion among
yeah.
among the communists.
Yeah, no,
They
that's
thought that, yeah,
that's that's pretty blatant.
yeah,
Um, and there's still, you said there's like 6 times the size of the other one.
yeah. At this time, MLS is really the only real big organization, and the British still need them to a very great extent for almost all operations. Now, 1943 is an interesting year in many regards because while this distrust is going on, Italy is getting invaded. The British Special Operations Executive guys are told, listen, we want you to create as much of a distraction in Greece so that the Germans think that Greece is getting invaded, not Italy. And that's the thing. They actually tried to do that, but they knew that the only way they could do that is by asking EAMLAS to conduct attacks because they were the ones that had a pretty big armed force. Because by 1943, EAMLAS guerrillas number in the thousands.
Hmm.
And they are sent. So they're told that an invasion of Greece is happening. Prepare your guerrillas and go on the offensive against German and Italians all around the country. Amelas says, "Okay, we're down. Let's do this." They attack all over the country. 8 German divisions are rushed to Greece, which is considered a success for the operation on the British
How
side.
large is a division?
A World War II division, German divisions were around 14 to 15,000 men.
Okay, so a lot of people.
Yeah, no, it was 8 divisions is a lot of people.
Okay.
Modern American divisions number in like 20 to 25,000 people, of course. But
Um, just to, I guess, to contextualize this for me, you
mhm.
said Germany sent 8 divisions in response to what was happening there. How many divisions were there available in that region to be sent at the time?
um, in the region, I'm not sure. I think the overall size of the German army at the time was over 200 divisions, but
Okay.
the 8 divisions for the Mediterranean region is actually quite a bit. You're pulling
Okay.
some resources for run because not all divisions are fighting divisions. Some of them are doing garrison duty. Some of them are fairly lightly armed. But they actually gathered 8 divisions to send over to Greece, which the British considered a pretty sizable, uh,
Right.
you
And
know,
presumably those would have been divisions defending Italy. Uh, or,
uh, yeah,
yeah.
to a certain extent.
So, for our listeners out there, we just had to take a very short break. So, to recontextualize things for me, let me make sure I understand where we're at in the story. We have the Britain backed uh, group convincing the leftist insurgency group that has more territory but is being funded less to start a very large guerrilla campaign to distract the Germans from the invasion of Italy, to make them think that they're actually invading Greece and divert resources. And they managed to convince them to participate in this, and it was a wild success because they moved 8 German divisions to Greece, and that's where we left off.
Yeah, close.
Okay.
It was the British Special Operations Executive, so it was
Okay.
the British agents that convinced the Greek resistance to actually take part in this. They convinced
Gotcha. Okay.
Amelas to take part in this. But
It's-
they lied to them. They told them that, hey, this is going to be the big invasion. Um, so it's
oh, they lied to them. Like,
yeah,
the,
they lied to
oh,
them. They said the British, the invasion of Greece is coming. Uh,
oh, okay.
yeah, so they try to, so they do this thing. The German divisions arrive. It's a success, but the German divisions enact reprisals against the local population, which is primarily supportive of EAM, and this really damages relations between Eamelas and the British. At the same time, a delegation is sent to Cairo to discuss like the positions of the resistance uh, and 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 the return of the king and all these things. And it's also really mishandled by the British, who completely underestimate the political like power of the resistance leaders that are sent there. So the resistance has been really soured. The Eamelas is really soured by this whole situation, and it feels betrayed by the British. Uh, and it's also feeling super suspicious of Edes. Um, at the same time, there is the collaboration government of Greece has been reorganized under a new prime minister who is tasked by the Germans to recreate the security battalions because the Italians are getting basically destroyed. They are getting dropped out of the war. They the invasion of Italy happened in 43. Um, and the Americans and the British are fighting in Italy. The Italian regime collapses, and so does a lot of the occupation force within Greece.
Okay.
The Eamelas also managed to seize the weapons of an entire Italian division, which they surrounded and disarmed. They wanted to try the leadership for like being fascists, and they were fascists. Of course, they were the leadership of the fascist Italian division. They were but they were also helped and like safeguarded by the British. At this time, even though things were strenuous, they still tried to maintain a common command, the two resistance movements, but relationships were strained. The removal of Italian divisions and the strengthening of Eamelas resulted in an almost complete cease. Like they almost completely stopped giving weapons. So the British almost completely stopped giving weapons to Eamelas.
Hmm.
Um, at the same time, British agents within are getting more suspicious of Amelas, and they think that they're plotting something. The Foreign Office says that we must throw all our weight behind Zervas, and of course, at the same time, like a bit earlier in the year, Zervas pled his loyalty to the king, which rebukes the whole point of the Republican League, that the Greece won't be a monarchy.
Right. Now,
This, yeah.
sorry, you said the British were being suspicious of Eamelas.
Yeah,
Were they actually plotting something at this time, or was that just wild, like, speculation on their part?
they they were like Amelas did have the eventual goal of a like of power in post-war Greece, but they were. It's not like they were fighting against a legitimate government to do this, right? There was an actual power vacuum in Greece, and they were
Okay.
by far one of the less malicious actors to
Okay.
take power. Because if you see it, like who are the power sources? There is the government in exile, which is basically a British puppet that descended from the monarchist dictatorship and the of Metaxas. There is the collaboration government, which no one sees as legitimate in the Allied camp, and then there is then there's the resistance movements,
Mhm.
Amelas and Teves. That's it.
Gotcha. So it would be fair to say then that they weren't actively plotting anything, but they were pretty clear that our
Yeah.
long-term goals are to be the legitimate
Yeah,
authority in Greece.
they
Okay, all
were
right.
organizing a takeover of power in a country that had a vacuum of power.
Okay,
So they
all right.
were just trying to fill in the responsibilities of a state that didn't exist. Now, the Germans did reorganize the collaboration government and made them, at the same time, made them have the security battalions. The these were basically right wing former Metaxist like officers and policemen that were armed to the teeth and sent out in the Greek countryside to basically enact massacres and anti-communist action. And it was really the thing with Rallis is that he thought that the as okay, wait, let me put that in better words. During the end of the war, the main thing in the Germans' mind, in German minds, apart from like the Holocaust, was this idea of like an anti-communist crusade, that we can convince the Western world to engage in an anti-communist crusade to save Germany, basically. Uh, and the basically the reorganized government of Greece thought its goal to be far more anti-communism than anything else, and they thought that they would basically be supported by the British in this endeavor, which isn't a really poor assumption. Britain really didn't have much to do with this, but when Greek when Eamelas troops surrounded and disarmed Asphalia, like those marauding gangs, right?
Hmm.
They found out that the majority of them thought of themselves as pro-British and anti-communist.
That tracks.
Yeah, so the at this time, Amelas is pretty much convinced that Britain is supporting Edes, which, keep in mind, they have pledged their loyalty to the king at this point, rebuking their republicanism.
Hmm.
The Amelas is convinced that the British are supporting the monarchy, and that they're gonna bring it back with the force of arms if necessary, and they don't care about Greek liberation as much as what post-war Greece will look like, which is a really accurate assumption of what Britain was doing. Um, there is a basically there is a breakdown of communications between the groups in late 43, and a series of skirmishes escalates to a full to the first phase of the Greek Civil War
And this
uh,
is between
between
Eamelas
Eamelas
and
and Teves. Yeah,
this.
Eamelas aims with this to kind of like uh, basically liquidate all other resistance movements and bring them into the fold.
Okay.
Basically, they said, okay, we're the big one. Let's just unite everybody under our banner, whether they want it or not. And anyway, most other resistance movements were right wing, and some were extremely right wing. Some
Yeah.
were even like just anti-communist, like gangs that would just
Now,
go around and murder people.
would it be fair to say
Mhm.
that uh, Eamelas was correct in their suspicions of Eves? Because it strikes me, just knowing what I know about British imperialist history, that if the only guerrilla movement that they had in a country where they wanted to have interest post-war decided to abandon the Republican government and be pro-monarchist, I would imagine that the British government would just kind of roll with it and go, well, fuck it, monarchists are better than communists.
Oh, they were. That's the thing. It was at the express encouragement of the
Okay.
British monarchy and the British Foreign Office and the British agents that this shift towards monarchism in Edes happened.
Oh, okay.
Keep in mind, Edes, like the leader, the military leader, has really no strong feelings about any of this. He's just in it for the money.
Gotcha.
And he basically alienated a big part of his initial leadership in that move
Hmm.
towards monarchy.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, very briefly, what what happened was that yeah, they wanted this post-war power. They wanted the king to come back. The Greeks didn't really want that. And Eamelas now is trying to assimilate all other groups. The British obviously see this as an act of aggression
Hmm.
with the groups they themselves created. Keep in mind, this wouldn't even exist if it wasn't for the British at this point, because they funded it and they even threatened them if they didn't go out in the resistance. Then the war. The war is brief. Elas pushes Edes back into Epirus, but the British cut off all supply to Eamelas until hostilities end, and they fund Edes and give them ammunition. Eamelas doesn't have the ammunition to just keep fighting them for a very long time, and they can see that they won't be able to assimilate Edes, even though they destroyed a lot of other smaller organizations. So another truce is signed, and a treaty of cooperation between the two resistance movements is signed, and they also sign over overall control of the Greek resistance to British generals, Middle East Command.
Hmm.
So even though there is this brief, few month war between Elas and Edes, uh, which is considered the first phase of the Greek Civil War, things are kind of amended towards the end of it. But the British right now see the communists as cynical. That's goes the same for the communists and the Amelas, sorry. So there is really very little chance of reconciliation at this point. So if we so now we go into 1944, and Germany is falling apart and they're slowly withdrawing from the country, right? The EAM is now controlling the vast majority of the country, and they set up like a rival government within Greece, which is the first time women get to vote in Greek history,
Fuck
interestingly.
yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah, they were like for their time they were fairly egalitarian, and they cared about this thing called laokratia, which it roughly translates to people power,
Hmm.
people's control. And in general, even though the Communist Party had some autocratic tendencies, similar to they did admire Stalin. Keep in mind this is during World War II, so admiring Stalin isn't a big deal. It's not like admiring
Yeah.
Stalin in the year 2020.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Different times.
yeah, different times. Of course, the Communist Party though is run a lot like Tito. So imagine they're mostly closer to something like Tito or Vietnam, right?
Hmm.
How they run things, because they're a resistance movement. They're really popular, and they and but of course at the same time they are enacting swift and brutal justice to any people they consider their enemies. Keep in mind, even though you can control a huge part of Greece, keeping proper trials, maintaining prisons is really hard if you're an occupied country. So a lot of the time, the prisoners of war would be murdered by MLS, which would often be used against them in later recountings of the war. But if we actually think about it, it's not something too out of the ordinary for a resistance movement to just straight up kill people and not take them prisoner. Pretty much
Yeah.
every other resistance movement did this.
I think that's kind of an important point, just to briefly bring in the concept of war is hell.
Yeah, it's not
And
easy.
yeah,
Yeah,
and if you are a guerrilla movement, whether you're on the side of righteousness or not, you do not have the resources to build and buy yourself a better class of hell. And you're going to act like a demon sometimes just by the nature of the thing that you're in. So I and you're a military historian, so I don't
yeah,
need to explain any of
I
this to
know.
you,
Yeah, I know about
but
this. Yeah,
but I think that when we evaluate things that happen in war, we need to understand the context in which those things are taking place. And there's a reason we should avoid war if we can, because it is the sort of place where summarily executing people because you don't have the resources to take care of them the way you would want to in an idealized situation is a legitimate thing that is on the table for
yeah,
you.
yeah.
Um, so,
It's also important to keep in mind that the Greek resistance movement at this time is also under siege from the Germans, and even like the Germans, as they're pulling out, they are giving money and supplies to the Greek collaboration government to continue the anti-communist struggle. There are some credible like beliefs that there's a modus vivendi, so like an agreement between Zervas and the German leader in in Athens, that no attacks would take place against Edes, so that there can be a coordinated anti-communist thing. So in the eyes of Amelas, they are well justified in committing a lot of murder. They also have hit squads that primarily target ultranationalist, fascist, and right wing like political forces. They try to explicitly avoid killing liberals, and there
mhm,
was the murder of like a fairly well respected military officer that took place in the hands of Eamelas, which a lot of its leadership like went into a frenzy about. They said, "Why the hell was this person murdered? We did not want to do that. That was really bad optics." Let's say
mhm,
this because it's wartime, right?
right,
Like murder happens a lot, but killing Dimitrios Psaros was really bad, and it furthered the idea in the eyes of the British that this group is in pretty much irreconcilable with British interests, right?
right. Yeah, that is the just the moral calculus involved in waging a guerrilla movement is I think something that warrants its own podcast just by itself.
Oh yeah,
So, but yeah, so they made an oopsie. It sounds like.
yeah. They did make an oopsie, but keep in mind, like most of the like executions, even the summary executions, like all these things, they did try to put like the people that they captured through their legal system, like the
Hmm.
people's courts, and some people were actually found innocent. Some people were actually left to live there. It's not like they murdered everyone they captured.
Right, right.
It's not like, but a lot of the time, justice was swift in the mountains.
Without passing moral judgment on it, this is just what happens when
Yeah,
you're in
it
this type of
does.
situation.
Yeah, it does happen. So it's really interesting how the British used this, like against the resistance and the guerrillas, like after the war. Even though like a lot of other movements did stuff like this and needed to do stuff like this to survive.
Yeah.
Now, very briefly, basically, as the British pull out, as the Germans pull out, and the collaboration government is left on its own to conduct its like operations. Elas and Darius Veliotis decide, okay, let's smash these guys, and they engage in a ton of battles as the Germans evacuate. They not only harass German units, but also attack and destroy a lot of security battalion units. And they also have their hit squads and organize like this whole battle to kind of like capture Greece. They're not fighting Edes directly at this time. There is a ceasefire between them. There's collaboration, whatever. There's not this. There isn't as big a conflict between them. They're just the fighting the movements, fighting other like anti-communist movements and the collaborationists. Keep in mind, at this time, Elas is at the height of its power. It's mid to late 44, and Elas has 50,000 armed guerrillas, which is insane for like a country as small as Greece and occupied. Not only did they have 50,000 armed guerrillas, they were fairly disciplined and organized
Hmm.
and commanded by generals. They had even some artillery pieces that they stole from the Italian division. They had a cavalry detachment. They they were like genuinely organized as an army. The People's Liberation Army was an army.
Yeah. How
And
many people are there, like just Greece citizens at this time?
at this
Just to,
time, around 7 million, 6.5 million,
okay, so
something like that.
50,000 is like a pretty, yeah, it's
It's
pretty
big.
considerable.
At the height of its mobilization, the Greek army during the Second World War in 1940 numbered 450,000 at the height of its power when all of Greece was mobilized. Eamelas controlled around 2 million people in free Greece, and the mountain government. That's how many people they held.
Yeah,
Around two
that's
million, fifty
okay.
thousand, and they had around like 100,000 in reserve that simply could not arm, you know,
Right,
because they didn't have as many guns because they're occupied, you know.
right.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
built this whole thing under occupation, and yeah, so they do this. They have they have gone into an offensive. They hold outside of Athens. Athens is evacuated, and now they controlled most of the country, and they are preparing for Britain to arrive. And they do. They arrive. They bring a Greek prime minister with the government in exile to Athens, which is already controlled by Am at this point.
Okay, so sorry, they were taking so the prime minister was brought back to
Yeah.
British controlled Athens.
Yeah. So I should say during this time, the Greek, like the exile army, you know, that 18,000 men that I mentioned, the Greek army in exile, whoever got evacuated from Greece when Greece fell, had been purged of any left wing elements. There was a pro Am mutiny, and around from the 18,000, only 8,500 men were left. The rest were imprisoned in prisoner of war camps. So the British had Greek soldiers in prisoner of war camps. You know, the Greeks were their allies. So it's interesting to, you know, you
Right.
mentioned that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so they have two main like units that are hardline anti-communist. It's the Sacred Band, which is a like a commando unit, and the Third Mountain Brigade, which fought in Italy, in like the Rimini Brigade. So the British are bringing back those forces, and the Eamelas is fairly nervous. They say, "Well, these forces are explicitly anti-communist, and we're here in the spirit of cooperation. We want to set up like a collaboration government." And Papandreou, which was the prime minister, had set up essentially the government of national unity, where also some EAM like representatives held some positions in the government, even though those positions were in the minority, despite EAM Elas being perhaps the most legitimate power within Greece, though the exile government was still the recognized one. So the government of national unity is back in Greece, and Papandreou is like a fairly savvy politician. He knows that like he has to work with Eamelas if violence is to be avoided, right?
Right.
So he basically chants their motto, Laocratia, like their like people power. He provides a pretty egalitarian social democratic agenda that was fairly well liked by EAM members, because keep in mind, most EAM members aren't hardline communists. Most of them are, left leaning people who came together in a time of occupation, right? Even some
Right.
liberals are in EAM.
Right.
Um, the core is controlled by the Communist Party, sure, but these people like really just want the war to end, and like for people power to be back, and for the king to not return. Those are the main concerns. So the Papandreou government pledges a referendum of the on the monarchy, and EAM representatives like they they basically ask Papandreou um, they ask Papandreou to disband the they wait, let me rephrase. They want a national army, okay? They want a Greek national army that to get reconstituted along the like with its core being the Hellas troops, which was the majority of Greek troops in
Hmm.
Greece at the time. 50,000 is pretty large. At the same time, the rightists don't really want that. And but in order for a disarmament, a reorganization of the army to take place, there needs to be some collaboration. So EAM, EAM Elas goes ahead and tells the Papandreou government that's fine. Let's work together on this, but just disband this like the Third Mountain Brigade and the Sacred Band, because those are just anti-communist. They want to murder us. We know they want to murder us.
Right. Yeah. Just get rid of all the people that are like
Yeah,
having meetings about how they want to kill us. And
yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Because at this time, there's a really like a standoff, right? The communists are armed, and they know that like if they disarm without like any disarmament taking place on the other side, they're making themselves vulnerable. So they're holding on to their arms, and they Papandreou realizes this and knows that they can collaborate. So he says, "Okay, that's fine. I'm gonna disband the Third Mountain Brigade, and I'm gonna put this left-leaning social democratic general at the head of like the general staff and the organization of a new army, like based along the last lines." Great, great. The communists find this as a great compromise,
Hmm.
and they think, okay, we can work with this. Othoneos, which was the general, is pretty decent, and he's also trusted, and he's a pretty good like compromise figure. And then come the British.
Yeah. I was going to
they
ask. So when does that guy get murdered?
so basically, Churchill sent General Roland Scobie in Greece, who was completely ignorant of Greek politics, and thought and was under the impression that this is according to Mark Mazauer. He was under the impression that the government that the Papandreou government was entirely legitimate, and that but was under the control of Churchill, not independent. He thought that the Amelas were just like a bunch of like disorganized mob, like communist criminals, kind of. That was his impression.
Hmm.
Keep in mind what they've done, like throughout the war, right? They've created this whole thing, you know, the whole
Hmm.
organization of the Amelas, a legal system, a government, elections in an occupied country, an army of 50,000 men. Like they've done like so much to organize themselves. But Scobie completely underestimates them. And what he does is he dismisses Othoneos, which was the compromise general, and puts a hardline anti-communist in his stead, and then he orders EAM Elas to disband within. So the Elas forces, the 50,000 men that they built with such difficulty over 2 years of occupation, they asked them to disband within 72 hours and surrender their arms.
How'd that go?
Not well.
Okay.
They basically said that, well, we can't allow this to happen. They decided to Amela's leadership decided, okay, we shouldn't fight them directly because this is just not gonna go well. So let's just start a general strike and a big protest. Okay. So they sent thousands of EAM protesters into the streets of Athens, and some march on Syntagma Square, of course, because that's where everybody goes.
Mhm.
And in the Hotel Great Britain, there were a bunch of snipers, and the head of police gave an order to start firing into the crowd. So dozens of
Good.
people were killed, and at this point, there's like the this little pause after the people are murdered, and basically the general secretary of the Communist Party, who was an interim secretary at the time, Georgis Siandos, a man, keep in mind, who is disfigured. His leg was disfigured from torture during the Metaxast years. He says that, okay, they want to kill us, they want to put us back in prisons, we won't stand for this. And he sent orders to the Elas units that were in Athens and outside of Athens to move into Athens and expel the British and the Greek forces. At the same time, the British had collected as many of the former security battalion people, the ones that were collaborationists and fascists. They had gotten as many of them as possible armed, so that they would be ready, because there weren't that many British soldiers in the capital. Uh, and then the Decembriana began, which is the second phase of the Greek Civil War.
Okay. So things are nice and chill. Nobody's in a bad mood, right? And I actually don't see what the problem is. Like we just had like what, only 12 people got murdered for no reason.
Yeah, and it really just confirmed all the suspicions of the Communist Party, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And during the December events, it was a month of fighting in Athens between Hellas, the British forces, and Greek government troops. And it was really fierce battle. But of course, like as time went on, even though the British were squeezed into a corner, the EAM Hellas could not drive them completely out of Athens, and they slowly started bringing. They brought two Indian divisions. They brought tanks. They brought planes, and they kind of like did a shock and awe, like complete devastation attack against Hellas, and drove them out of Athens. And they just couldn't continue fighting, you know, because and they couldn't do this because Hellas really did know that Greek people needed humanitarian aid from the British.
Hmm.
They couldn't just start a war, you know. So they said, okay, we can't fight anymore. Um, we're gonna disarm Hellas. Just please, let's come to an agreement about post-war Greece. So, after a month of fighting, the Varkiza agreement is struck, whereby free and fair elections would be held in Greece. In the interim government would be controlled by the British. Eamelas would be disbanded. Not Eamelas, just Elas, the armed wing, would be disbanded. But there would be general amnesty for any fighting. Um, and then Greece would move into a general election and a referendum on the monarchy, which is, well, an okay compromise. But the problem is that the British had set up this state, the Greek state, right? Uh, they had collected all the worst dregs of former bandits, former fascist generals and politicians from the former Metaxast government. They had collected some of the worst people imaginable, to lead this government. Like the monarchist forces in Greece were like fairly fascist. So so they relied on this government to keep its promise to like uphold the rule of law and not persecute lefties.
How'd that
This
go?
did not happen.
Okay.
The British tried to keep like apolitical or liberal prime ministers at the helm. Papandreou, who was perhaps the best guy to lead this government, resigned because of the Decembriana, because she said, "Well, I told you so. This was going to happen
Hmm.
if you did." And but they didn't. So the British like had those governments. But during this time between the right and all those nationalist bands like had their main goal the rigging of the election. So they went that's when the white terror began, where
Okay.
where thousands of people were tortured, thousands were murdered, lots of rapes took part around Greece, and
And
primarily targeting left groups. And the
and
government,
who is doing that?
uh, that was mainly done by right wing gangs and former Asphalia like people, like
Okay.
security battalion people. But the government kind of like turned a blind eye to it, and the British. Well, I'll put it the way David Close put it in his book on the origins of the Greek Civil War. He said that uh, the British, of course, wanted free and fair elections in Greece, but they also wanted the return of the Greek monarchy, and their want for the Greek monarchy to return started to work against their will for free and fair elections.
Hmm.
So even though the British were interested in free and fair elections, like they thought that a little bit of left suppression won't hurt anybody, you know.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, is that similar to just? I mean, that sounds very similar to most of what we know about um, imperialism as it's been conducted in the Anglosphere.
yeah,
Is we're in favor of free and fair elections as long as the guy we want gets elected.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and basically the the elections were like um, were of course like really badly rigged. Pretty much all local like guys were against the Communist Party. The Communist Party was legalized by the Varkiza Agreement, and they were eligible to run in the 1946 elections. So there's a gap right now between December 44, where this war happens, and the Varkiza Agreement in early 45. Some people thought that this was a cynical ploy. Like there were some like left-wing gangs that formed in self-defense or from like the right-wing terror. Aris Velouchiotis went into hiding and tried to continue the guerrilla war against the British, but he was captured and beheaded uh, by
Hmm.
by um, by right by right wing like insurgents. And so in 1946, the elections happened. The Communist Party said, "No, we're not taking part in these elections because they are rigged. They're just straight up rigged. We won't legitimize them." But this didn't do anything. The Conservatives got elected. So there was the return to 1935, right? The same government from 1935 took power, pretty much. So back to square one.
Yeah.
And during the disarmament, the British asked for 50,000 guns, and the Greek guerrillas provided 50,000 guns plus a bunch of stuff like to give them, but they did hide around 30,000 of their best quality weapons in case something went like that, right?
Right.
Something went wrong. So um, those weapons formed the basis for like a guerrilla army, the DSC, uh, and that's what we considered the beginning of the Greek Civil War, like the failed elections, the plebiscite that also confirmed the return of the king, which was also rigged really badly. No, basically no organization, uh, like not even British organizations, recognized the election results as legitimate.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I think I also forgot to mention during the December events, like media, like the BBC and other media, like the United States, all of them condemned Britain for like essentially like murdering like allies. You know,
Interesting. I was actually going to ask what the reaction abroad was of the treatment of uh, Eomelas in this.
what happened
Uh,
was they were extremely condemning of Churchill, but then Churchill just showed them mass graves and said,
mm,
look at them. Those savages just murdered regular people." He didn't mention that most of them were collaborationists or fascists or
mm,
people that fought the resistance. But yeah, that kind of silenced international condemnation. And
gotcha.
in 1946, after the elections, there was a former Las troops attacked a police station in Litohoro, and that's usually marked as the beginning of the Greek Civil War, the actual
Okay.
civil war, the third phase, which saw the Greek guerrillas of the Democratic Army of Greece, the DSC, fight the government troops that had British support through 1947, and then American support after that between 48 and 49. During the
Mm,
Greek Civil War, napalm was even dropped in Greece, and because the Greek guerrillas fought in a very conventional fashion, they were soundly defeated while they sought to establish like a capital, because they just didn't control a big enough area. They they were supplied by Tito, but then there was a falling out between Tito and Stalin, and infighting started in the Communist Party. Well, they failed. In 1949, basically the war was over.
so they effectively lost control completely of the area of Greece that they had set up support and supply
Yeah,
lines through
yeah.
prior to this. Okay.
Yeah, they lost control of, or most of it. They had some control over northern Greece. I should mention that Zervas's troops were almost completely destroyed during the Decembriana in Epus Bayam Elas, but they were airlifted to Corfu by the British, and that's what
Mm,
allowed him to become a politician post-war.
gotcha. And so during this, so eventually the United States actually backed the was it the monarchy at this point or a dictatorship? Uh,
Um, the monarchy returned in the plebiscite.
okay,
Yeah,
okay.
but
So
I think just very briefly because I do have to go.
sure.
Um, I just like I think Greece can serve as an example of like an old version of like decentralized organization,
Hmm.
because that's how EAM really ran things as a disorganized like as a decentralized like state apparatus. But
Right.
also we should see this as like it's a microcosm of almost all leftist revolutions. There is outside meddling. There is and I think yeah, it's really hard. There is so much to be said about
Hmm.
the Greek Civil War, and so many people, so few people know about it. I think yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it does sound like. I mean, it sounds like a blueprint for how one would expect something like that to go in a world where there are going to be other power structures vying for control of the piece of property you're trying to self-organize,
Yeah,
right?
it is. Yeah, it's the Greek Civil War is really interesting, and it has caused a scar across Greek society. Um, that still remains very much alive. My grandma remembered the Greek Civil War.
Yeah,
She was also she was in favor of the communists. at the
Mhm.
time. And it is such a a bleak part because like Britain essentially decided that Greece would be monarchist after the war, despite all uh, all calls and needs of the Greek people. Like everything, like they tried to fight for. The like the British just kind of rebuked and managed to single-handedly defeat. Um, after the war, like if it wasn't for the British, really, Eamelas would probably have taken over Greece, like Tito did in Yugoslavia.
Yeah, and like so many others
Yeah.
across the
Um,
world. Um,
it is, yeah, and like I don't know. I think like if something um, if I have to say something definitively is, oh my god, guys, revolution is not an easy thing. It's super complicated. And the Greek communists, I think, did about as good a job as someone could have been expected to do at the time. I get so mad when people over trivialize how easy a revolution is. I think like at some point I need to talk about Vietnam as well, because people seem to not know that Vietnam like was fighting since the 40s to
right.
become like become independent. It's not an easy thing. The Greek communists made a lot of mistakes, but it's not nothing unreasonable. And
Right.
the British just kind of like, well, snapped their fingers and like destroyed the effort of a revolutionary movement that had persisted for years.
Yeah, I think the story that you tell and the story of so many other movements of similar nature that we could study elsewhere in the world is one that it's easy to get lost in the rah rah rah, we're fighting for freedom and self determination part of it, without paying attention to the absolute grisly, grinding difficulty of committing an entire generation or two or three of people to this struggle that will unmake everything that exists, and then you have to rebuild it, and that is not an easy thing to do by any means. And it's not something that we should fetishize, but something that if we're serious about should be thought very carefully and deeply about.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's there's really, I think the how complicated like revolutionary action actually is, I think is really underestimated by a lot of people who, you know, like the theory, like the ideals, like the imagery, like the, fist up, we're like bringing down the system. But there's a lot of uncomfortable truth about how these things function that I think like people over trivialize. I there's I think like Greece serves as an excellent example of how a revolution can go bad and like like damage a country forever.
Yeah. Not just go bad, but go bad even if you win.
Yeah, go bad despite you doing like the best possible. Like they
Yeah.
played like almost all their cards right. But like they failed. It
Yeah.
is it's really sad.
Yeah. So if you had to recommend like like a piece of work or a couple pieces of work for people who want to study like what Eamalas did and the difficulties they had, and like what would you recommend people go out and read?
Well, I think from what I've read, I haven't read something that talks about only Amelas from Amelas perspectives. They tend to be pretty skewed as it is, but like a book that talks about the organization of of Amelas and talks about the Greek Civil War in general and how it came to be is The Roots of the Greek Civil War by David Close. I think it was the most helpful book that I read in writing my dissertation, and I think you'll find it really interesting.
Okay. We will recommend that to all our listeners. And I am conscious of your time. I know you said you had to get going. Is there
Yeah,
anything else that you want to add to that story, or anything else you want to say before we get out of here?
yeah. Sadly, I don't think I have time for that. People seem
Okay.
to be uh,
Yeah, blowing
pestering
you up.
me. Yeah,
All right. Well, George Richard Hannay, thank you so much for joining us. This it was a pleasure talking to you as always, and we hope to have you back some point.
thank you so much, Mark, for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and I'd be glad to come on and talk about anything else.
All right, man. I'll talk to you later. Have a good one.